Welcome to this week's Concurrency Beer 30. I'm Nathan Wisnowski, Concurrency's Chief Technology Officer, and I'm joined this week by Justin Watts, a technical architect on our communications mobility practice. Welcome, Justin.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
I see that you're drinking a beer. What kind of beer do you have today?
This is a Coors Light, just keeping it simple.
Keeping it simple. Nice Rocky Mountain High kind of beer. John Denver kind of angle.
Precisely.
Awesome. I am having a Great Dane. It looks kind of like a Coors Light in a sense. They might be offended by that. But it is a nice kind of smooth drinking German style beer. So excellent, really good. Awesome. So we are here to talk about identity, but identity under the context of something special near and dear to my heart, which is M&A.
Yes.
So you've been doing a fair amount of M&A activities, both where you were before coming to Concurrency and where you are now at Concurrency, helping customers with identity engagements. Tell me a little bit about how identity is a component of M&A. When you think about that.
So that's a fair question. From my perspective, I generally think of it as the starting point for merger and acquisitions outside of the organizational business practices, right? So first we really need to understand, is it a merger, is it an acquisition, is it a divestiture? Maybe it's a joint venture, for example. And asking some of those core questions, and that'll really drive what the foundation of the infrastructure supporting that organization looks like. And then from there, we can generally make some educated decisions as to what they might want that infrastructure to look like, be it Active Directory on premise, or general security principles of how we're going to secure those identities once they're created.
Got it. Naming, I would expect would come into play here, right? I'm let's say I'm doing a spin, and I've got to take part of my organization and move it into a new one. I'm assuming naming comes into play as part of that motion pretty significantly.
Yes. So once the foundation is really there, we have Active Directory in place. We'll put tools in place, and we think of binary trees, West Migration Manager, or ADMT, and we can leverage those technologies to transform that account naming convention into what it needs to be. But we need to be, cautious about some of the implications that happen when we change naming conventions. It is an opportunity to pay up on technical debt per se, and transform that into what might be best practices, but then we really need to be clear about operational change management activities and the impact that has on people logging into applications in their computers on a day-to-day basis.
Got it. Is it, when you think about the dependency that identity is,
Yes.
how does that come into play when you're moving fast with the identity project because you're moving fast with the M&A project, everything else is dependent on it. How does that kind of fast-moving nature, the dependency nature of identity, but wanting to do it right, and then maybe building on that, how does that all factor in your mind?
It really comes down to organizational objectives, and we look at the timing that we want the activity to be completed in, and that'll drive a lot of the decisions that we make if we need to start with more simplistic solutions and then build on that once everything's in that target domain.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. When you think about the provisioning process, I think a lot of companies struggle with that.
Absolutely.
I've sometimes heard some companies say, what's your source of truth? Well, it's Active Directory. I'm like, whoa, I don't know if it's really your source of truth, man. When you think about that provisioning process in respect to M&A, how do companies do this right and how do they do it wrong?
So I would say the way that I always approach the problem as a starting point, and I guess every organization is different, so there's many different ways to do this, but where I generally start is to leverage the existing processes that are in place for the parent company. And then from there, we use that technology, binary tree, request migration manager, and we essentially leverage existing data in that Active Directory to transition those accounts and manage them the same way that they're being managed today. And it's a very elegant way to handle that, and we don't have a lot of management overhead of setting up an identity governance tool or identity lifecycle management tool to do that activity in the initial phases of the merger acquisition.
So what do you think about the identity cleansing equation? If you have a set of users, they're being migrated from one organization to another, or they're being consolidated or spun off, and the identity environment is not at the position it needs to be in. It's that manager's information isn't correct, or the location information isn't correct, or when they work isn't correct, all these kind of things that define how and when you move them or migrate them. What part of the migration involves identity cleansing in your opinion?
I think if we look at it from the perspective of the existing environment that they're in today, we know that we really can't disrupt those processes that are in place, right? And sometimes we can, and it really just depends on the situation. But where we need to, what I would generally do is maybe add on additional metadata to those accounts, an attribute, for example, that has specific values that I'm looking for. I think some of the biggest challenges in doing things like that is the ongoing management of that information. As we talk about a manager's information, if we have to provide upkeep to that, that can be difficult at times as well.
Especially if the source system isn't a system of truth, like an HR system, for example.
Absolutely.
And it's kind of like just project centric. Now, when you think about the cloud and how it relates into this, a lot of companies, when they're divesting, they have on-premise Active Directories, and there's another on-premise Active Directory, and kind of migrating that. How does the cloud and Azure Active Directory and Office 365 and all the components of that fit into this picture?
So with building a new environment, it really is the opportunity to do things the right way. And as we start to look at the applications that are being transitioned over and even the workstations, it enables opportunities for us to maybe pay up on some of that technical debt of a legacy application and leverage things like Azure SSO or Azure B2B to enable additional capabilities into those applications that they necessarily haven't had before.
Okay. So that might be an opportunity for them to be able to do something a little differently, but it might be faster.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Maybe an example like, synchronizing passwords. For Azure, you can connect where people might be using ADFS and not using passwords.
Oh, definitely. Yeah.
When you think about the relationship between the identity and applications they may be accessing, you talked about, leveraging cloud services, for example.
Sure.
How does this move into, all right, now I'm using a cloud service, I'm using a cloud application, that sort of relationship between the identity and making it easier for that user to access those cloud services, especially if I'm taking the opportunity to do it better this time. How much of that is stuff you do initially in the M&A versus things you might be doing a little bit later on in the M&A?
It depends on the applications that we're migrating. If they have native capabilities to enable that, it may be worthwhile to do that up front. Generally, when we're doing application migrations, normally towards the tail end of a merger acquisition, then we have to evaluate each one of those applications and understand how they fundamentally authenticate and authorize users. And that drives how they're going to be impacted by the actual migration itself. So that'll give us the opportunity to make those decisions to see if moving out to Azure is the right move, or maybe we lift and shift and keep it as is for the moment and then develop a roadmap to transition it at a later time.
Got it. It probably depends on the TSA period too, right? Like if it's a longer TSA period and their application migrations are happening over an extended period of time, then perhaps they have a little bit of time to do some of those things right. Whereas initially for day one they might have just provisioned some identity infrastructure for the login to a mailbox.
Right.
So
yeah,
you're right. It probably depends upon like time frame and when and what, and all can kind of fit together. When you think about things like modern desktop and how it plays in, what do you think is going on there that's exciting? Is it when you think about the transitions around Azure AD joined machines or passwordless scenarios? What gets you excited about what's happening now in the future of identity that people can start to take advantage of?
So I guess when I think about modern desktop, the core principles that are being replaced on premise and being like policy management and things like that to machines, I think that's an extremely valuable feature that's available in something like Intune, for example, that gets us away from doing things in a way that's really complex and difficult to manage at times when we think about all the group policies that possibly exist in the organization. And then in addition to that, we have application management, for example, and then MDM even for like Windows devices today in which we can enforce policies on those machines. So I think it's a much more, intelligent way of managing the device than maybe done in traditional infrastructures.
Got it. You are a person who's been involved in this community for some time. You're an architect, led large projects. We certainly have people at Concurrency and people you've worked with, customers that are just entering into the market. They're new to the technology space. They're getting involved. They're interested in identity. They may be growing a career in identity, or maybe even someone who has been in the identity space for some time and needing to retransition their career and wants to grow in identity. What would be your recommendation for people who are trying to kind of move into this new this new space that the identity ecosystem is moving into?
The thing that I find the easiest way to get into the identity space is really start with the basics. I think Active Directory is still a core component that is used in a lot of organizations, and that's really a logical starting point from my perspective. And then it would be more ironing out the process and introducing yourself to new technologies like Azure AD Connect, and then start playing with foundational services within Azure Active Directory.
Got it. Do you find that for an individual who's entering into the identity space who has no current experience, that it's easier for them because they haven't been in sort of the legacy environment for a while, or is it harder for them because they don't have that established experience on understanding traditional Active Directory and how it fits into Azure AD Connect?
I think that it makes it more difficult for a new person coming into identity because they don't necessarily have some of the foundational understandings of how applications function and work. And if you have somebody that's been a little bit more seasoned or worked in various components of infrastructure within an organization, they generally have more of that knowledge of understanding how servers function and how maybe they interact with things like Active Directory, use DNS, and things of that nature.
Got it.
Yeah.
We were talking a little bit about conditional access. I think not necessarily name conditional access. We're talking about how Azure Active Directory relates into Intune, which relates into other things. When you think about conditional access, what are the core sort of blocking and tackling elements of that a company should, even if they're going through an M&A, should make sure they stand up initially when they go through the process?
I think the biggest component for me is going to be hybrid join, making sure that we have the ability to secure organizational devices.
Okay.
One of the bad practices that I see out there is trying to use like the trusted IPs and using your egress points to try and secure content. And I think there's a lot of exposure that can potentially happen when going down that path. So that's definitely something that I would like to see more organizations doing.
Got it. Right. So you mentioned at one point, we were talking about conditional access, we were talking about the ideas around controlling and managing devices. You mentioned also E5, in cloud app security and things around that. Tell me about what that means to you. Why should a company think about some of the components that exist in E5, particularly cloud app security?
Right. So when we're talking about cloud app security, we have the ability to secure content that's now in flight. So it's not about using Azure information protection anymore and just making sure that I'm classifying my documentations. I can actually put policies and enforce those policies when I'm interacting with services that are integrated with cloud app security. And I just think that that's an extremely valuable service that a lot of organizations are going to start using down the road.
Got it. Thank you. All right. So last question.
Sure.
When you think about the fact that you've aligned a lot of your career with identity, and that's been something that's important to you, it's something you've spent a lot of time on, and sometimes it's really exciting, and sometimes it can be annoying, all the elements that go into that. What makes you get up in the morning and say, yeah, I really love doing this. This is something that excites me, makes me love coming to work and working in this particular space?
I think from my perspective, it's really understanding how a business functions from the technical underpinnings underneath it. And I guess what I mean by that is that you look at the starting process of HR onboarding somebody into the organization, and you're involved from each step of that account and essentially everything that is accessible to the organization. And having that understanding is one, challenging. And I think that when you're completed with projects like a merger acquisition activity, it's extremely rewarding as well.
Awesome. Well, thank you for joining me today, Justin. You have been super helpful. Cheers. And thank you for joining us on Concurrency Beer 30.